terrifying wedding. Chapter 1. The Sinister Estate. The estate of Bartholomew York stood ominously on a sprawling tract of land in upstate New York. Once a symbol of prosperity, it had become a place of whispered fear among the local villagers. The manor house, with its decaying facade and overgrown grounds, seemed to loom over the surrounding countryside like a dark sentinel. Bartholomew York, the master of the estate, was as much a source of fear as the house itself. A man of considerable wealth and influence, he had long ago abandoned any pretense of kindness or decency. Bartholomew was known for his arrogance and cruelty. His wealth had afforded him the luxury of treating those beneath him with contempt. He took pleasure in belittling others, whether they were the peasants who worked his land or even the most powerful men in the region. It was said that he had once openly mocked a governor to his face, daring him to retaliate. But it was not just his boldness that made Bartholomew feared, it was his capacity for violence. Stories circulated about how he had beaten a peasant to death for poaching a single fish from his private pond, or how he had ruined a young woman's life simply because he could. The villagers had long lived under the shadow of Bartholomew's tyranny. There was no escape from his wrath, and those who crossed him often met with mysterious misfortunes. But as fearsome as Bartholomew was, there was one man in the region who inspired even greater terror: the warlock. This warlock was a figure of local legend, a man who seemed to embody the very essence of malevolence. He lived in a ramshackle hut deep in the woods, away from prying eyes. By day he was seldom seen, but by night he roamed the village, leaving a trail of misfortune in his wake. Barns would catch fire without explanation, livestock would disappear, and sometimes those who had wronged him would be found dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. The warlock was not merely a man, he was a force of nature, a living embodiment of all that was dark and evil in the world. Despite his fearsome reputation, Bartholomew York cared little for the warlock's supposed powers. When he heard of the man, he scoffed, dismissing the tales as mere superstition. After all, Bartholomew feared nothing and no one. But he had yet to meet the warlock face to face, and in his hubris, he believed himself invincible. The warlock, on the other hand, had heard of Bartholomew. He knew of the landowner's cruelty and arrogance, and though he had never crossed paths with him, he was well aware of the man's disdain for those he deemed inferior. It was only a matter of time before their worlds would collide. In the meantime, life on the estate continued as it always had. The peasants toiled under the weight of Bartholomew's oppressive rule, praying each day that they might avoid his notice. The manor house, with its darkened windows and creaking floors, remained a place of dread, a tomb where only Bartholomew's presence seemed to hold sway. But as the villagers whispered of the warlock in the shadows, they could not know that the seeds of their master's downfall had already been sown. The day was fast approaching when Bartholomew York would discover that even he was not immune to the powers of darkness. Chapter 2. The Warlock's Curse. The villagers of the surrounding countryside had long understood the importance of keeping the warlock appeased. Over the years, a tradition had developed whenever a significant event, such as a wedding or a harvest festival, was planned. A cart full of offerings would be assembled and sent to the warlock's hut. These offerings, usually consisting of food, drink, and other valuable goods, were a form of insurance. The villagers believed that as long as the warlock received his due, he would leave them in peace. Bartholomew York, however, had no patience for such nonsense. When his son Nathaniel announced his intention to marry Catherine, the daughter of another wealthy landowner, Bartholomew dismissed any notion of following the villagers' superstitions. His wife, a woman of deep faith and wisdom, pleaded with him to send the customary offering. But Bartholomew would hear none of it. "Why should I bow to the demands of a crazed old man living in the woods?" he scoffed. "I am Bartholomew York. No one, not even a so-called warlock, will dictate how I run my affairs." His wife, knowing her husband's temper, said nothing more, but a deep sense of unease settled over her. She knew the stories how the warlock had cursed those who had crossed him, how entire families had vanished or been struck down by mysterious illnesses. But Bartholomew was a man of unshakable will, and once he had made up his mind, there was no changing it. As the wedding day approached, the villagers grew increasingly anxious. Word had spread that Bartholomew had refused to send the offering, and whispers of doom circulated through the village. Some even considered leaving the area for the duration of the wedding, fearing that the warlock's wrath would not be confined to the York estate. But Bartholomew, oblivious to their concerns, busied himself with preparations for the grand event. The warlock, meanwhile, was well aware of Bartholomew's defiance. The wind carried the news to him as he lay in his hut, surrounded by the trappings of his dark art. His reaction was immediate and fierce. To be disrespected by a man like Bartholomew York was intolerable, and the warlock vowed to make an example of him. On the night before the wedding, as the moon hung low in the sky, the warlock began his preparations. He gathered the necessary ingredients: bones of the dead, herbs of ill repute, and a vial of blood from a creature that had never seen the light of day. With these he brewed a potion of unimaginable potency, one that would bring about a curse so terrible that its effects would be felt for generations. As he worked, the warlock muttered ancient incantations, words of power that had been passed down through the ages. The air around him crackled with energy, and the shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord. When the potion was complete, the warlock poured it into a crude clay vessel and sealed it with wax. "This will be Bartholomew York's undoing," he whispered to himself. "By the time the sun rises, he will know the full extent of my wrath." With that, the warlock set out for the York estate, the potion clutched tightly in his bony hand. The night was silent as he walked, save for the sound of his footsteps crunching on the frosty ground. The villagers who had dared to stay behind cowered in their homes, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. By dawn, the warlock had reached the edge of the estate. There, he buried the clay vessel in the cold earth, uttering one final curse as he did so. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and for a moment, the entire estate seemed to shudder. Then, all was still. "The curse is set," the warlock murmured. "Now let us see how the mighty Bartholomew York fares against the forces of darkness." Chapter 3: The Wedding Day. The morning of Nathaniel York's wedding dawned bright and clear. The skies were a brilliant blue, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. It was, by all appearances, the perfect day for a wedding. The York estate had been transformed for the occasion, with colorful banners and garlands of flowers adorning every corner. The grand manor, usually so foreboding, now seemed almost inviting as it basked in the sunlight. Inside the house, preparations were in full swing. Servants hurried to and fro, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The kitchen was a flurry of activity as cooks prepared an extravagant feast, while outside, tables groaned under the weight of wine, pastries and delicacies from across the region. Guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest clothes, and were greeted by the sight of a lavish celebration in the making. Nathaniel York, the groom, was a striking figure in his tailored suit. Handsome and confident, he bore a strong resemblance to his father, both in looks and in temperament. He had inherited Bartholomew's arrogance and was known for his wild streak. Though he was young, he had already earned a reputation for his ruthless behavior, especially toward those he deemed beneath him. As the hour of the ceremony approached, the guests gathered in the courtyard, eager to witness the union of two powerful families. Catherine, the bride, was a vision of beauty in her white gown, her golden hair cascading down her back. She was the picture of innocence, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness, a sadness that came from the knowledge of the man she was marrying. As the couple stood before the altar, the priest began the ceremony. The vows were exchanged, and the rings were placed on trembling fingers. Just as the priest was about to pronounce them husband and wife, A sudden chill swept through the courtyard. The air, once warm and pleasant, grew cold and heavy, as though a storm was about to break. The guests shifted uneasily, glancing around in confusion. Bartholomew, who stood proudly beside his son, felt a prickle of unease but dismissed it. He was determined that nothing would mar this day, not even the warlock's rumored curse. But then, the warlock appeared. He seemed to materialize out of thin air, standing at the entrance to the courtyard, his eyes burning with malevolent fire. He was dressed in a ragged cloak that billowed in the unnatural wind, and his long, matted hair hung over his face like a veil of shadows. The guests gasped in horror, and several of them instinctively backed away. Bartholomew's eyes narrowed as he saw the warlock. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "What are you doing here?" Old man Bartholomew demanded. "This is a day of celebration, not a place for the likes of you." The warlock's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I have come to witness the union of your son, Bartholomew York," he replied in a voice that was cold and sharp as ice, "and to remind you of the price of arrogance." Before Bartholomew could respond, the warlock raised his hand. The earth beneath them rumbled, and the sky darkened as though the sun itself had been blotted out. A palpable sense of dread filled the air, and the guests began to scream as they realized that the curse was coming to fruition. Nathaniel, standing beside his bride, felt his body stiffen. He looked down in horror as his skin began to harden, turning to cold, unyielding stone. His eyes, once full of life, froze in place as the transformation consumed him. Within moments, Nathaniel York was no more. In his place stood a lifeless statue, forever trapped in a moment of fear. Catherine, witnessing her husband's transformation, let out a piercing scream. She reached out to him, but it was too late. The warlock's curse had taken hold, and there was nothing she could do to reverse it. The guests scattered in terror, desperate to escape the cursed estate. But the warlock's power was absolute. He turned his gaze upon them, and one by one they fell to the ground, their bodies convulsing as the curse claimed them. Some turned to stone, others simply dropped dead where they stood, their hearts stopped by sheer terror. Only Bartholomew remained standing, his face twisted in fury. He drew his sword and charged at the warlock, determined to end the threat once and for all. But the warlock was too powerful. With a flick of his wrist, he sent Bartholomew crashing to the ground, his sword clattering uselessly beside him. As Bartholomew struggled to rise, the warlock loomed over him, his eyes glowing with dark triumph. "This is the fate you chose, Bartholomew York," he said, "and now you will pay the price for your hubris." Chapter 4. The Warlock's Revenge. Bartholomew York lay on the ground, gasping for breath as the warlock's words echoed in his ears. The once mighty landowner, who had ruled over his estate with an iron fist, was now powerless before the warlock's dark magic. He could feel the weight of his sins bearing down on him, but his pride refused to yield. "I am not afraid of you," Bartholomew spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you can defeat me with your tricks? I'll kill you with my bare hands." The warlock smiled, a chilling expression that sent shivers down Bartholomew's spine. "You still don't understand, do you?" he replied softly. "This is not a battle you can win. Your strength, your wealth, your power, they mean nothing in the face of true darkness." Bartholomew roared in defiance and lunged at the warlock, his hands reaching for the old man's throat. But as he moved, he felt a searing pain shoot through his body. He cried out, collapsing to the ground once more. His muscles seized, and he realized with horror that his limbs were beginning to stiffen, just as his son's had. The warlock watched with cold detachment as Bartholomew's body slowly turned to stone. "You are a fool, Bartholomew York," he said. "And now, you will join your son in eternal damnation. As Bartholomew's vision darkened, he heard the warlock muttering an incantation. The ground beneath him began to shake, and a deep, malevolent energy filled the air. Bartholomew tried to scream, but his voice was silenced as the curse took hold. The last thing he saw before his eyes turned to stone was the warlock's triumphant face. The warlock stood over the petrified bodies of Bartholomew and Nathaniel York, his expression one of grim satisfaction. But his work was not yet done. He raised his arms, calling upon the full force of his dark magic. The sky above the estate crackled with energy as the warlock unleashed his final curse. "Let this land be cursed for all eternity," the warlock intoned, his voice echoing across the estate. "Let no life thrive here. Let no joy be found. All who set foot on this land shall be bound by the darkness that dwells within it. This is the fate of Bartholomew York's legacy." As he spoke, the ground beneath the estate split open, revealing a chasm of black, writhing shadows. The manor house groaned as its foundations shifted, and the once grand estate began to crumble into ruin. The trees withered, the grass turned brown, and the very air seemed to thicken with despair. The curse spread across the land like a plague, infecting everything it touched. The animals that had once roamed the estate freely were caught in its grip, their bodies twisted into grotesque forms. Birds fell from the sky, their wings too heavy to lift. And the once proud horses in the stables collapsed, their hearts stopped by the warlock's curse. Within moments, the York estate was transformed into a desolate wasteland. The once vibrant land was now a barren, lifeless void, haunted by the ghosts of those who had perished there, and at the center of it all stood the warlock, his eyes glowing with dark satisfaction. His task complete, the warlock turned and left the cursed estate, his form dissolving into the shadows. As he disappeared into the night, the full weight of his curse settled over the land, sealing its fate for all time. Chapter 5: Bartholomew's Despair. The curse had claimed everything Bartholomew York had ever known. His estate, his wealth, his son, all had been reduced to nothing by the warlock's dark magic. Bartholomew, now a lifeless statue, stood frozen in a pose of agony, his face twisted in eternal despair. For those few villagers who dared to return to the estate, the sight was one of utter horror. The once grand manor house was now a crumbling ruin, its windows shattered and its walls covered in thick, black vines. The gardens, once filled with blooming flowers, were now overgrown with thorns and weeds. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sound was the mournful creaking of the house as it slowly sank into the earth. But the curse had not just claimed the land, it had claimed the people as well. The guests who had attended Nathaniel's wedding were nowhere to be found, their fates unknown. Some said they had fled in terror, never to be seen again. Others believed they had been swallowed by the earth, taken by the warlock's curse. But the truth was far darker. Deep within the cursed estate, in a forgotten corner of the manor, the souls of the guests were trapped. They wandered the halls as restless spirits, doomed to relive the terror of that night for all eternity. Their wails of despair echoed through the ruins, a haunting reminder of the warlock's power. Bartholomew's spirit, too, was not at rest. Though his body was frozen in stone, his soul remained conscious, trapped in a state of perpetual torment. He could feel the weight of his sins, the guilt and shame of his arrogance and cruelty, pressing down on him like a physical burden. But there was no escape, no reprieve from the warlock's curse. The warlock's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his failure. "This is the fate you chose, Bartholomew York," the warlock had said. "And now you will pay the price for your hubris." As the years passed, the legend of Bartholomew York and his cursed estate grew. The villagers spoke of the haunted manor in hushed tones, warning their children never to venture near it. Some claimed to have seen Bartholomew's ghost, wandering the ruins, his face twisted in agony. Others told of strange lights and sounds emanating from the estate, the signs of restless spirits trapped within. But no one dared to go near the estate. for they knew that the warlock's curse still lingered, a dark stain on the land. The York estate had become a place of dread, a monument to the dangers of pride and arrogance, and so it remained, a cursed and forsaken place, forever bound by the warlock's dark magic. And yet, on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, the villagers would hear a sound, faint but unmistakable, the sound of Bartholomew York's tortured soul crying out in the darkness. A reminder that, in the end, no one is immune to the consequences of their actions. Chapter 6: The Sleeping Estate. Decades passed, but the curse on the York estate remained as potent as ever. The land, once fertile and thriving, was now a wasteland where nothing grew. The manor house had sunk further into the ground, its roof caved in, and its walls crumbling to dust. The few who ventured near the estate claimed that the very air around it was thick with despair, a palpable sense of dread that drove them away. But while the land lay barren, the curse had left one curious effect. The animals that had once roamed the estate freely, deer, rabbits, birds, had all but disappeared, replaced by something far stranger. In the absence of predators, the remaining animals had grown bold, even aggressive. They moved through the ruins with an eerie calm, as if they were the true rulers of the cursed land. The few villagers who lived near the estate spoke of strange sightings: rabbits with glowing red eyes, birds that flew silently through the night, and deer that stared unblinking at those who dared approach. It was as if the curse had twisted the very nature of these creatures, turning them into something unnatural, something dark. And yet, despite the curse, life on the estate continued in a twisted, grotesque form. The manor house, though crumbling, was still inhabited by the spirits of those who had perished on that fateful night. They roamed the halls as shadows, reliving their last moments over and over again. Their whispers filled the air, a chorus of despair that never ceased. But the most terrifying aspect of the cursed estate was Bartholomew York himself. Though his body was frozen in stone, his presence was felt in every corner of the land. It was said that on nights when the moon was full, one could hear his tortured cries echoing across the fields. Some claimed to have seen his ghost, a towering figure with eyes of fire, stalking the ruins in search of vengeance. But the curse was not confined to the estate alone. It had spread to the surrounding land, affecting everything and everyone within its reach. Crops failed, livestock died, and the villagers who lived nearby suffered from a string of misfortunes. It was as if the very earth itself had been poisoned by the warlock's dark magic. Despite the dangers, the story of the York estate drew curious souls from far and wide. Historians, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers all made their way to the cursed land, hoping to uncover its secrets. But few returned, and those who did spoke of horrors beyond imagination, of spirits that whispered in their ears, of shadows that moved on their own, and of a presence so malevolent that it drove them to the brink of madness. And so the legend of the cursed estate grew, becoming a cautionary tale for generations to come. The once great York estate was now a place of dread, a symbol of the dangers of pride and arrogance. It stood as a monument to Bartholomew York's downfall, a reminder that even the most powerful men could be brought low by their own sins. As time went on, the estate was gradually forgotten by all but the most superstitious of villagers. The land became overgrown with thorns and brambles, the ruins of the manor house hidden beneath a canopy of twisted trees. But on nights when the wind blew just right, and the moon was full, the sound of Bartholomew York's tortured cries could still be heard, a ghostly reminder of the curse that had consumed him and his legacy. In the end, the York estate became a place of silence and darkness, a cursed land where no life could thrive and no soul could find peace. And so it remains to this day, a haunted, forsaken place, forever bound by the warlock's dark magic, a testament to the terrible power of the supernatural and the tragic consequences of human hubris.